Welcome to CISO Insider, Nightfall's chat with Chief Information Security Officers. We host CISOs from different industries to discuss their pathways to the role, the challenges they face in their everyday work, and lessons they can share with anyone aspiring to become a CISO. This podcast brings you into the world of cybersecurity and gives you a window into the most brilliant minds in the business. Segment CISO Coleen Coolidge joins me on CISO Insider to talk about what she's learned on her journey in cybersecurity. Today, we're talking about topics like the value of doing compliance well as an affirmation that your team is doing security the right way, approaching mergers and acquisitions as the acquirer with a learning mindset, and the bravery that's required for CISOs to excel as good people managers and good security practitioners. We'll get into these ideas and a lot more in part one of our chat. Please join me in welcoming Coleen to CISO Insider. Thank you so much, Coleen, for joining us today. How are you doing?
I'm doing well today. How are you doing, Chris?
I'm great. I'm so excited to have you here on CISO Insider. In our previous conversations, you mentioned you were tricked into going into security when you were managing projects in 2005. And today you're a CISO. So can you elaborate on that path?
Yeah. And first of all, I know that totally sounds like clickbait, but I guess like the best stories, it's true. My path had a lot of twists and turns. And so there's a ton of detail, but just the TLDR of it was back in 2005. I was managing projects that were about like analyzing mortgage data for a subprime lender. And so it will be able to output things like which borrowers are more likely to default. And if that is true, like reach out to them and see what kind of like loss mitigation or, what we could do to get them on track before they fall into trouble. So you can imagine there was a lot of like sensitive data there. And we also had no security representation on the project. In fact, no security training whatsoever for anybody who worked on projects. Developers didn't go through any security training. We were just sort of mildly aware that there were InfoSec policies and then an InfoSec team out there. So the people who were actually on the project, it was me helping the PM. We had a developer, we had a QA person, we had the vendor who was doing the analysis. And then at some point, the PM started stepping out of the project meetings to take calls with this broker. Not even exaggerating. Like he was just like, hey, this is more important for my long-term thing. I think you got it. You know how to handle these meetings. You know what the goal is. He would like leave me to run the meetings and then update all of the project manager documentation and do all the communications. So this happened for several weeks, probably about 9 weeks. And what ended up happening was about halfway through where he kind of just said, like, you're doing a good job. I'm just going to go sit outside on the bench and talk to, my broker. We had this security person essentially like knock on the conference room door, peek his head in and say like, hey, is this the right project for blah, blah, blah. And we all looked at each other like, yes. And he goes, great, I'm going to sit in here and observe. And I'm going to do a security design review. And so I looked at the QA person because that was my very, very first introduction to a real live security person. So I looked at the QA person and I looked at the developer and they looked panicked. They looked at each other and they looked at me and they kind of did that like, like cut off at the neck kind of thing. Like, no, get him out of here. And I was just like, what's wrong, guys? Like the more the merrier. Like, let's make this project go really well. It shouldn't it be secure? Let's do this. So we just continued our meeting. And so at the end of it, the security person takes me aside and said, hey, can I see your project documentation? And because I was so proud that I was keeping up on it for my PM, I gave it to him. And so this guy's looking through it and his name's Ian. And Ian's looking through and he goes, And he started just looking very concerned and sort of highlighting areas. And I was just like, I don't understand what's happening. So for me, never talking to a security person and having no security background and then having no security touch points. And this person comes out of the blue and starts marking stuff up. So fast forward a bit, he comes to us and he said, like, what I don't want to say to my director of security guys is that this project's not being run well because you don't have security representation. We're just like, you're here now. What do we do? And he's like, the way that you are sending files is not good. You're not clearing out the files. Like they're staying too long on the server here. Did this vendor that we have here go through the proper review? Like, yeah, we went through procurement. And he's like, oh, procurement doesn't include a security review. And so what we found through him looking at our information was that this was representative of every single project that security was being left out. At the procurement side, nobody was really being trained in security basics and security principles. Developers and QA people weren't being trained. And then I didn't have a template that I could use. It would have a little insert area that would say, are you transferring? Are you doing anything or touching, storing PII? If so, what kind? And then point us to the point of the policy, where it says you need to do this thing. There was no sense of a checklist or references. And so yeah, of course we were going to do a really bad job. And I'm glad that he marked those things up, because if you think about it, if that were your mortgage data, would you want zero security representation on that project? And so I took him aside and I was like, hey, this is really my first project that I'm running alone. You could see the PMs out there on the bench in the sun with this broker. I'm happy to fix these things with you. And so really section by section, he was just like, could you revise this template to include the security activity that needs to happen? So we did that. And so we fixed every single area that was a concern for him. And we even, I've made an appointment to talk to our procurement person and said, let's put a third-party security review in this process because it's missing. And they're like, what? It's not even your job to talk about this. I'm like, yeah, but the security person's unhappy with this and said that everybody has to do a bit of security. So let's figure out how to have this in your procurement checklist. So from the network security side to storage to the way the code was being developed, we made sure to put those security activities. And I will tell you that the QA person and the developer, they were like, every time you introduce a security person onto a project, they slow it down. Their job is to say no. Their job is to really just get in the way. And we actually, through this, they were like, can you change the recurrence, the date, the recurrence, the day, and the conference room that this meeting is in, and leave him out of it? And I was like, come on, guys, we're almost 3/4 done. Let's just actually get it done right. Let's get his approval. Let's just start using this stuff. I mean, it's not really that bad. If it were your mortgage data, wouldn't you want it to be handled this way? And so everyone was like, oh, fine. So, eventually that project concluded. And then the very last meeting that Ian had with us, he was just like, pretty much you guys went from an F- to an A-. So huge improvement. Come to find that we were the one and only project that got targeted that did this well. And so we were like, okay, that's awesome. And I took that template into the future and was just like, I can use this from now on and I never have to see this guy again. And then I saw him on stage because we had this reorg. It was, typical large company where there are reorgs all the time. They put a new org chart up on screen. And I saw that some of the old security people had moved out. And this guy had moved to the very top of the stack. He's the director of security now. He made his bid on stage and said, we're going to start hiring like crazy. Security is a growing field and, you'll never go hungry again if you are a security person. And there's just so many ways that you can go wide and go deep. And it's one of the most interesting fields out there. So we're going to be hiring. And right after that meeting, he came up to me and said, how would you like to come work on my team? And I was like, no, man, nobody likes this field. I don't know what if you know what people say about security when you're not in the room, but usually people don't want anything to do with what you're offering. And so it's probably not going to be good. And he's like, oh, what is managing projects going to get you? Anybody can manage a project. Software can manage a project. He's like, but not anyone can do security. And he's like, the way that you helped transform this project into something that was really horrible into something that was actually pretty good in the end. He's like, that's the kind of transformation that we need. And if you're a person who can do that, you should come work in this field. And he's like, just think about it. He's like, what if, how about you give it a try for 1 year? If you do it for 1 year and I'll point you in the right direction, I'll make sure you get trained. And if you hate it, if it's not for you, you can always go back to managing projects. So I was like, sure, why not? I'm early enough in my career that this could be okay. And so I did it. And he put me through like a week of SANS training. So it was like Unix security, Windows security, network security, cryptography, the standard with the lab and the test. And so I was like, okay, I think I can do some of this stuff. But many of those topics were like things that I had really never dealt with before. And they went quite deep, which I wasn't necessarily ready for. And so I did okay. And he decided like the way to really solidify the training that I have and to get a sense of what everything, was out there for security, he decided to put me on like these little 3-month secondments. So I would drop in to a particular part of the team. So for example, with the network security folks, and at the time that they were really getting into forensics using NCASE, and they were just like, we're having some issues with people possibly doing something weird with loans. come help us. So I learned how to use NCase, how to do, maintain chain of custody, how to do the collection of evidence, how to do the searches. I'd essentially just go like group by group, jump in and help with all of the grunt work. And so if they needed documentation made or updated, then I would do that. If they needed, reviews to be done, like if it's an access review, then so that's my job. For the other side of network security, they were just like handed me this green pager and they said, do you know what this is for? And I was like, yeah, it's like when your friends call you and you can send messages. They're like, no, it means you're on call. And when you're on call, when it goes off, you need to respond. And these are the procedures you need to follow. And so I was then, I had to look at the alerts coming in from the firewall and the IPS. And being a beginner and being thrown at the bottom of like each of these stacks was not fun. There were days that I went home and I was crying and I was like, this is the worst thing ever. Like, why would anybody sign up for this job? But it taught me, the very basics of what it's like to be on each of these teams. And he'd even done that for the application security side. And I was just like, I don't have a developer background. And they're like, yeah, but can you threat model? Can you follow directions? Can you have other people follow directions? Like, yes, have that background. Great. You're going to stand and present and do a threat model for this particular application over here. And I found that it wasn't as terrible as I thought. And one of the best things from that secondment where I went to, app security, network security, and like desktop security, just going through each of the groups, the most gracious group of internal customers I ever came across was definitely the developers, because, I told them right away, like, look, I don't have the same background that you do. The background that I have is security. And even then, like, I've only been doing a short time, but here's what I do know. And so I found that the developers were extremely helpful, helping me to decompose their application, where are the inputs and the outputs, who would care about attacking this? What is the most valuable piece of this? So going through that, I don't even think I did an awesome job, but the look of discovery on their faces and like, oh my gosh, I don't think anybody had ever sat with them before and asked them to look at their application and their features the way that an attacker would, because they always looked at it as if they're a user and they wanted to maximize and get the most out of everything, and it's like, but what if you have a user who's bad? How would any of these protections change? So I would say it was mutually beneficial. My boss really wanted me to gain experience in every single area. Like, he even had me do a stint with the physical security, so the building security folks, anything that he could think of. And he's like, oh, there's an audit coming up. We need you to do some review work and get prepared. And if we did bad on something, like help write the management response. So I think I got like the full buffet table of what it was like to work in security. And at the end of that first year, then he came to me and said, like, let's talk about this. Let's talk about your review. He's like, you've learned so much, everything from working on NCase to writing policies to helping us try to pass audits, to working on the IDS, to like revamping, network documentation and helping developers. Like, do you really want to go back to just managing projects? And I think he knew the answer was no. Like, how could I, even though I had started at the very bottom and honestly still was at the bottom, there was just so much richness in the broad field of security that there's just no way that I would go back. Because he was like, yeah, just for 1 year, like, you'll skill up, it'll be fine. And you'll go back and be an even better project manager. He knew. I think he knew.
We're going to take a brief break and get back to more questions with Coleen Coolidge from Segment. You're listening to CISO Insider from Nightfall AI.
Nightfall DLP is the industry's first cloud-native data loss prevention solution designed for high-growth companies securing sensitive data across cloud apps like Slack, GitHub, and Google Drive. Traditional data security solutions are painful to implement, require heavy overhead, and have high false positive rates. Nightfall customers are up and running in minutes with our library of machine learning detectors to protect PII, PHI, and other industry-specific data. Our developer-centric platform allows security teams to configure content inspection as code for customizable data protection. Learn more at CISOinsider.com/nightfallai.
You mentioned that compliance really speaks to you. And can you tell us about how that's become more important to you in your career?
Yeah. And so, as I mentioned, like when going through that whirlwind of stuff, I definitely played favorites. There were different areas of security that I just thought were more fun and more effective and really like They were the real security. I did not necessarily think that about governance, risk, and compliance. And now looking back on it, I was just like, well, I was young. I didn't know what I was talking about. But part of that was because of the way that everyone else treated compliance. Every single security person I worked with back then, they treated this as a really boring but required checkbox exercise. There's a long list of things that you need to say that you do. And that if somebody shows up on a certain day, you need to be able to prove in some way, shape, or form that you do it. And even people who had helped us, and I would say that, they had a Big Four background, they would say, like, you just got to do it. I'd ask, like, what does this actually mean? Like, if it's written down here, surely it's meant to actually protect someone or something. And sometimes they just look at me and put their hands up and just be like, like, I don't know, like, it's there. And if we don't do it, we're going to fail. So, like, let's just figure out a way to, like, write it down in a way that looks right. And that never sat well with me, because I thought, if we're going to go through the effort of not only writing these things down, but then putting the people in the organization through these exercises, they should actually have a real purpose. If they're not making employee data safer, if they're not making customer data safer, if they're not making our operations safer, why are we doing it? It took a really long time before I came across people who were able to really articulate the value of doing compliance, that piece of security, really well. And I think that, one of the conclusions that I came to is, if your security program is complete and it is effective, then you almost get compliance for free. It should be an attestation that you are working on the right things, and you're not just having people go through the motions, but you're actually reducing risk in the area that you mean to reduce it. And I feel like, that's not something that I really understood when I was first, like, airdropped into like a SAS 70 situation to fix. But, today, like, that realization has stayed with me. And the person that I ended up bringing on to be the director of GRC, he's really good. And I would say that, I call him, like, the Elon Musk in the best way possible of GRC. And what that means is that, he understands what the point of these things that are all, like, written down, these 150, 200, 350 things. He understands what the point of them, like, what they're trying to protect. But he is not married to, like, what's the old way of doing it? Do we have to use spreadsheets? No. Do we have to do things that feel like they have zero value and they just take up a lot of manual time? No. He would actually say, like, this is the actual goal that we're trying to achieve, and work with the team. So, for example, for something like change control, before we had, like, these modern environments, a lot of people who've worked in the old environments, you might dial into a bridge line once or twice a week, and you'd have this giant spreadsheet of changes that people in the org wanted to make. And so everyone was blocking one another, because if you're there representing your change, and so is someone else representing their change, but then they don't want you to make a possibly breaking change to their area, you would pitch your change, and then someone else would say, well, have you done this? Have you done that? Have you talked to this other person? Have you talked to this person? So it would just be this thing where we would all propose changes, and very few changes would actually get approved. We would do these dangerous changes on Saturday night at 10 p.m., which was just such a huge inconvenience. And so I never really looked at change management as something that was well done. I understand why we need to do change management, but I never understood, like, how we could actually do it right. Fast forward to today, our director of GRC worked really closely with the technical teams and said, like, explain, what is the purpose of change management? We're trying to make sure that we don't introduce changes to the production environment that could hurt our customers. And that could be anything from, like, you've messed up business logic because maybe you didn't do the right kind of testing, or someone pushed a malicious change that could cause, a flaw. And he sat with these folks, and he was just like, what is it that you want to protect? Where does it live? And so he was able to help identify these critical repos. And so once the critical repos have been identified, then it's like, who owns them? What's the process that you want to follow? And been able to standardize on, the process that we want to follow. And then working with the technical teams to come up with the technical solutions. So then if you're trying to push a change on one of those critical repos, then you need to make sure that there is testing. What does testing look like? You need to make sure that there's approval. What does approval look like? And so they went through several iterations, but where they've ended up is It's not that it's impossible to make an unallowed change, but it's very difficult because there are these guide rails in place that remind you, as somebody who might be new to making changes to that repo, like what you need to do to properly make a change, to make sure it's tested and approved by the right person. Because before, we would just have alerting go off when a person did something wrong, and it would pull them into a Slack room and say, like, hey, for this critical repo X, Y, and Z, Chris, you did not get proper approval. You better go fix it. And so you'd fix it after you had pushed the change and after you created the mistake. And now all of that alerting happens before. It's kind of an are you sure? So at the same time, it prevents these mistakes from happening, but it also educates people on a process that they weren't born with. So I just think that if compliance is thought of in the right way, it can actually be a big saving grace. And it's an affirmation that you're doing security the right way if you're doing compliance the right way.
I love that. I think that compliance in cybersecurity is so misunderstood and misrepresented, even underserved. So I'm so glad it's part of your ethos. I would like to address the elephant in the room with your time at Segment and Twilio. How do you effectively manage through mergers and eventually blended teams?
I don't think I have a complete answer for you, but I can tell you where I started. In my earlier days in security, I'd definitely been on the acquirer side. And so what I learned on that acquirer side, because depending on who we acquired, each company was very different. Their culture was super different. I think the mistake that I had made, when I was very young was, this is what the mothership, my company, wants you to know and wants you to do. Let's make sure you do it as soon as you can. And this is, just a few years into my security career. And I was really just following those instructions from the mothership. And what I found was, as an acquirer, you have a lot to learn from these acquired companies. There are things in every company's organization, specifically on the security side, that you're not doing extremely well. You might have a policy for it. You might have a process for it. You might have something, and it's just not in the shape. It's not at the maturity level that you want it to be at. And I think maybe one of the things that all acquirers do, which can be annoying to people who are acquired, is, well, clearly, since we're the mothership and we bought you, you just need to do what we say. We, of course, know everything better than you. We're, of course, better than you. And that is definitely the wrong place to come from. So I think I learned that relatively early on, that it's as I was teaching, just things like, this is how we do security in our software development lifecycle, or, let's go through the different types of security policies that we have that are different from yours. Let's do a compare and contrast. When I would do that and work with these other security folks on the other side, they could know as much as you, or maybe even more. And in some ways, their security could be better than yours. And so I think it's wrong to come at it with I'm the mothership, I'm the board, you will comply. I think it's better to treat an acquisition as an opportunity to come out as a superior hybrid model, because there's something that you're doing that's really good. So you have to figure out what that is and be honest about it. And there's something that the acquired company that's doing really good, that's awesome. And you need to figure out how to evolve, how to become that tertiary thing. So, I definitely softened my approach over time and looked at mergers and acquisitions on the security side of do they meet the spirit of this policy? What is this policy that we have trying to defend against or trying to promote? Are there things that they're already doing that are working? And then what could we just spruce up and then fill in the areas that they just have complete gaps in, instead of trying to completely remodel everything that they have? In fact, is there something that they have that we don't have at all, or we just do absolutely terribly, that we could just copy and paste and start using it? And I think that that's an approach that works rather well. And so now, being on the acquired side, we're actually going through that process right now. There's kind of a sense of who wore it best. And with who wore it best, I do think that, things that you can see is whose personality comes out on top, whose ego is getting in the way of this. This is all natural, normal human interaction. But I think one important takeaway for people going through, a merger and acquisition is that you are largely merging people. And when you merge people, there's a huge cultural component. People have feelings, they have fears, they want to be acknowledged, and you can't atom smash them together, because otherwise what you end up doing is a bunch of people will quit. And I'm happy to say that in the old days, one of the most important things for us was to preserve the people that were there. We wanted to make sure that the good people who were doing good work would continue to do so in the larger organization. So making sure that they have a path forward in their career, that they're listened to, that their advice is actually welcomed and implemented, instead of, saying, nope, that'll never work. And, I think that it's natural human nature, especially on the acquirer side, to push back and say, no, you can't tell me what to do. You couldn't possibly know. And I think that it's just a good message for everybody to kind of get over that. If you have the good fortune of meeting new security people, adding to your security community, you should welcome them with open arms. And I think on the segment side, that is definitely the way that we look at it, is like, we love our security community. We can't wait to make our acquaintance known amongst even more people, and we can't wait to invite more people. So that's the attitude that we take when we approach a situation like this. But as I mentioned, we're still relatively early into this integration, and I think the companies are trying to be very thoughtful about how things land, about what we decide on doing. And I think that there's definitely an effort to try to do, what's the best of both worlds? Let's do that.
What are the top 2 things you've learned from your team over the last year?
Oof, Chris, that's a hard one. Top 2 things learned from my teams in the past year. They teach me things every day, so it's pretty hard for me to just roll it up into a couple of things, but I'll try to bundle it into a couple of spots here. One, this is the best set of security, GRC, and IT folks I've ever had the pleasure of working with. I'm just going to get that out of the way right now. And when you have a lot of A players on the team, they create this virtuous circle effect. They make everyone nearby get pulled into this whirlwind where things just get better and better and better. Everyone gets better, including people like me, because I've never considered myself really an A player. I feel like I'm a very solid B, a respectable B player. And working with them, supporting them in their endeavors, helping to unblock them when there are issues, I feel like I'm getting better just working with them because of the level of excellence that they have every day. And that's something that I can't emphasize that enough. And I really would encourage people to hire the very best security, GRC, and IT people you possibly can. It's worth it. They, always show you what that next level of even better looks like. Most CISOs would be happy with, a good 3 to 5 year roadmap that has, gradually increasing levels of maturity and, increasing levels of good security. That's great. But they're never really happy to rest on their laurels. They want to one up even themselves. And so from Jeevan shipping self-service threat modeling, which is amazing, to Leaf shifting security right and being more like DevSecOps, to our GRC folks, Steve, Dustin, and Arda, revamping our third-party security program to be way more practical, useful, and frankly challenging and different from the status quo GRC teams usually produce. We also have Mike, who recently has shown me how to ship security product. That's not something that I'd ever done before. And I think this is probably the first time he's done it too. But the way that these A players just step up, get it done, raise the bar, they just don't rest until it's done right. And then they keep double checking and seeing, like, what else could I do? How else could I raise the bar? It can be a bit tiring to keep up with them, if I'm honest with you, but I'd rather expend my energy chasing after people who are really this good. This is a great way to spend my time. It's a great way to spend my energy. And, I look forward to the next couple of years, what levels we're going to achieve on top of what we've already achieved. And I'm really honored and humbled to work with them every day of the year.
Thanks for listening to CISO Insider, a podcast created and sponsored by Nightfall AI, the industry's first cloud-native data loss prevention solution. If you're enjoying the show, please leave us a review and rating on Apple Podcasts. The ratings and reviews help more people find us. Special thanks to Wendell Topper for podcast production support. Learn more about Wendell's work at www.createch.us. That's CREATEK.us. Follow Nightfall on Twitter, Facebook, LinkedIn, and Instagram at Nightfall AI. That's Nightfall AI, and email us at marketing@nightfall.ai with questions, feedback, and suggestions about CISO Insider, including suggestions for CISOs you'd like to hear from. Stay safe out there, and we'll see you again next time.